This is Canon Fodder, episode 20. My guest this week is a father, a husband, host of the Ironside Podcast, as well as the author of the Frank Sawyer adventure series of novels. This week we are discussing Richard Adams' Watership Down. Brett, how are we doing tonight?
Fantastic, brother. Super glad to be here.
Well, I'm really glad to have you on. I've been a guest on Ironside twice now, so I figured it was time to get you on my podcast as well. And when I asked you what book you wanted to discuss, you right away said Watership Down, and then you actually tried to give it away to somebody else. Why don't we go into first your relationship with this novel and what it means to you and what you really take away from it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I saw someone else, was talking about. It's like, oh man, I want to be so deferential that I was like, oh, maybe I should offer it up. But thank you for letting me keep it, because this novel is super important to me. So when we moved from the Chicago area to Washington State, a small town in Washington, I was 13. And our neighbors across the street, we were kind of, outside the city limits in the county. And they, walked across the way to introduce themselves. And they knew that I liked to read. And they gave me a copy of Watership Down. And since then, I have read this book every year. It's such a powerful book for me. And it seems kind of silly because it's about rabbits, but there's so much action, there's so much adventure. And it was really formative for me in terms of how I wanted to approach life and kind of the ethos I want to develop in terms of how I treated friends, enemies, and things like that. So this is my all-time favorite novel.
Yes, and I enjoyed the read as well. And you say it's a novel about rabbits, but that's to if somebody were to describe that as a negative, I think that they'd be mistaken. Adams does a really good job of personifying these animals while still keeping them pretty grounded. They even have a pretty complex religious sort of mythos system that I think really carries throughout the novel, and it's definitely one of the stronger points. Not only the vernacular and the language that they use, but there's a real sense of history in this book. There's a real sense of they talk about some of the legendary rabbits. Like one would talk about Achilles, or one would talk about Odysseus. It's very lived in world, and that's not to say juvenile. And I won't harp too much on the comparisons to the Iliad, but one could read the Iliad as a child and still grow with it for the rest of their lives. And I don't even think Adams would compare his work to the Iliad's, and I don't think anyone would compare their work to the Iliad. But just one of those things that sort of pops out in my mind of if I were a young rabbit, would I be learning the story of Hazel at Watership Down, sort of thing. But yeah, no, really, really fantastic book, and I'm excited to talk to you about it.
Yeah, and you're totally right. I mean, Adams himself, it was super humble, and he had no idea when he set out that it was going to be a bestseller like it has been for almost half a century now. And he thought it might do okay, but and this is a very common story with some of the best books. It was rejected over and over and over again because these publishers, they thought that that older kids wouldn't like it because it was about rabbits, which to them seemed babyish. And they thought that younger kids wouldn't like it because it's written in a more adult style. And so it really kind of foundered for a little bit. And then finally he was able to find a publisher who picked it up, and they said, hey, we can't print a lot, but we can get review copies on every desk that matters. And that's what happened. And it's funny because he's a Brit, but the book became really popular in the United States, and then came back from the United States to the UK and became popular in the UK, which is kind of funny. I mean, you look at like the Beatles, and they had to make it in America before they became
Right,
popular back
right.
home.
Well, and it's interesting because it is a very American story when you think about it. You have these sort of lesser second sons who, in the novel, they are forced out of the Warren because Fiver has a vision. Fiver is, sort of this weakling rabbit who is called a seer. So he has premonitions of the future, and he's always proven correct, which I think is a nice detail to add. Even I like that I like that he's always correct, but not always in the way that we think. I think Adams does a good job of quote unquote subverting our expectations or whatever. But he gives Fiver a lot of authority, and that in turn gives Hazel his authority. So I think the the power dynamics of the Warren are very good. But back to the point I was making about America, you have these second sons, right? These guys who are the outcasts of their society. A couple of you have one of the bigger rabbits kind of involved as well, but most of them are just sort of outcasts, and they go off to found a much better, bigger Warren, and it's sort of this. It's a story of providence in a lot of ways. One could compare this as a sort of manifest destiny, but at least in my copy, it comes with a small map, and we're really talking about like maybe 30 square miles of territory, which is a lot for rabbits, but in the grand scheme of things, it is almost inconsequential. So yeah, it's very interesting, and I find myself not vexed by the novel, but it is something that kind of sticks with you, and I can understand why you read it all the time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's that's a really good. I hadn't even thought about it in terms of like the an American sort of revolution style and that manifest destiny. But now that you mention it's totally obvious. Yeah, it's such a good story too, and talking about how it kind of takes place in like a microcosm, like just this small territory, but it's this big epic story to rabbits. And I mean, if you think about like kids who start reading this and their world view is so limited, and a schoolyard fight, fist fight is like Gettysburg to them, and then so those small things like do have a big impact. And it is kind of cool to zoom in and zoom out at these kind of ideas. And yeah, and you talked about some of the characters there, Fiver. And speaking of the Greeks, he actually based Fiver off of Cassandra, who was cursed by the god Apollo to always tell the truth and never to be believed.
Interesting. Okay, so when you say that, actually, what comes to mind is the Aeneid.
Yes.
This would be more so instead of Homer, we're more in the category Virgil, right? It's Virgil. I don't want to sound stupid on my own podcast.
Yeah, you can never sound
yes,
stupid, bro.
I appreciate it. But yes, so this is more akin to, this is the Rabbit Aeneid. So yeah, actually, yeah, even with the Fall of Troy, the more that I say it out loud, the more sense that it makes. And I'm guessing that that Adams was keenly aware of this. And one of the things that I like to do on the podcast, besides talking about writers and their favorite books, is these tangents. And one of the tangents that comes to mind is a classical education, because it seems to me that you can't write a book like this without being familiar with the classics. Friend of the show, Jay Burden, had a recent episode with the Athenian Stranger, who's also a friend of the show. Really good guys. Definitely recommend you guys listen to their content. But they talked about a classical education as being the cornerstone of Western civilization. And even today, with the liberal arts education that people get, is almost like a facsimile of a facsimile of what the classical education once was. And Brett, I'm kind of throwing a lot at you right now because we didn't discuss what we'd actually talk about here, but I wanted to get your thoughts on the classical education and how being a good reader maybe informs being a good writer.
Yeah, a wonderful, wonderful question. Yeah, and huge fan of Athenian Stranger. He's been a several time guest on the Ironside as well, and so I'm gonna have to go listen to that episode you mentioned.
I'll send you a link afterwards.
Yeah,
I
please.
really enjoyed it.
That would be great. Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that because so I went to a small liberal arts school in Virginia and called Southern Virginia University. And I liked it because it was small. Green was their color, and green's my favorite color. For some reason, they've changed it to red now, which is dumb. But my favorite class was the classics of Western literature. And my professor, Professor Clough, and I actually named the city that my first novel takes place in after him. A marvelous teacher, and just being able to read. And I had just come back from having been a missionary for 2 years in Peru, and there we only read the scriptures. So I hadn't read any books besides the Bible and the Book of Mormon for 2 years. So it was really cool to dive back into meaningful stories and literature. And it was just so great because these are timeless truths that are taught in these stories. And one of the points that Fiver actually makes in Watership Down when they're in Cowslip's Warren, if you'll remember that one, that was with all the snares that were placed around it.
Right. The farmer is hunting them, and they're kind of being trapped.
Yep, exactly. And that one was based off of the Lotus Eaters. They're just kind of stuck. Yeah. And so he actually makes the point, and he says, because they didn't want to hear about their adventures when they got there, these other rabbits. And Fiver says, who wants to hear about brave deeds when he's ashamed of his own? And that's, I think, what's going on now, because there is this sort of societal disdain for for lack of a better term, these kind of right wing or just red blooded stories of Aeneas and Achilles and Odysseus, just all these cool stories, even Don Quixote, and just all these figures, these heroic figures, are being pushed aside because so many people now, they are ashamed of their lack of courage. And so that's what I think a classical education teaches, and being able to read, it teaches you these values and these morals that you really can't learn any other way, even by experience, because it informs your experience, and everything is built on that. Even Watership Down, every chapter has this little epigraph at the beginning, and it's usually a quote from another poem, book, or historical figure. And I think that's, I know that's a long answer, but you have to be able to read. If you want to do anything in life, if you want to be a good fighter, if you want to be a good father, if you want to be a good writer, you have to be able to read.
So, and it's interesting that you said something that really piqued my interest, with experience sometimes isn't enough, right? Because experience can be informed by what you read. And it strikes me that anybody who reads scripture, anybody who reads the classics, you're going to map your own experiences onto that, and those great books that one reads that have stood the test of time almost act as a touchstone, or even a marker that you can measure yourself up against. So in some sense, and I don't mean to get all Jungian about it, but you could say that the experiences in a novel, because they touch so many different lives, and because they live so many different lifetimes, like I mean, the Bible's, New Testament's 2,000 years old. Old Testament's like what, 6, it through oral tradition, and Dostoevsky's a few hundred years old. The Aeneid is, from the time of Augustus, and Homer's way before that. So these works have lived several lifetimes, hundreds of lifetimes, and they are almost more real than the individual who reads them.
Exactly. That's really well said. And it's so true because and if you think about it, I mean, just having words in front of you, I mean, it changes everything. I mean, you look at I love the example. So the American Indians, it was such a foreign concept to them to be like, how can this piece of paper tell you things? Like it did not compute with them that you could write down things, that you could put ideas and words and stories onto a tangible bit of paper. And so I think that's really cool. Lafayette Lee, if you're familiar with him, one of the things that he credits his education and his great intellect, he's super wise and insightful, is just having the King James Bible read to him as a kid in the mornings. And you see all these signs if you drive by schools or YMCAs. They always have these reader boards outside that say, read to your kids 20 minutes. They're just begging people to crack open a book.
Right.
And I think that we are really on the verge as a society of getting to a lack of literacy. But then again, I mean, there's people like you who are just prolific writers and a publisher as well. And so, I mean, we're definitely taking the fight to the enemy being illiteracy. But it's these kind of stories that are really going to ramp up. I told my daughter, she's 8 years old, and I took her into her room, and you can see my bookshelf behind me. My wife's got an even more extensive one, and then our daughter has one in her room. And I said, look at your books. And she's got maybe a couple hundred books. And I said, you have more books within arm's reach than most of royalty ever read throughout their lives. I mean, books are precious, and we take them for granted nowadays.
I definitely co-sign on that. And it's funny, Paul Fahrenheit was a guest 2 episodes back, and he was talking about how we're moving into a post-literate sort of age, and that the podcasts like this and the Double Dealer magazine or books that I write or that you write or anybody writes are kind of a swan song, but we will not go gently into the night, as it were. I wanted to shift focus a little bit back to the novel, because I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned, especially living through what we're living through now. One could say that the gentleman on Frog Twitter, especially Battle Beagle, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he always has these cryptic tweets, and then he'll just quote tweet it with an event, a headline 6 months later, and it's like, how did Beegs know? So on our side of Twitter, we definitely have a sort of knowing. We have our own seers, and it's clear that we are headed for, hopefully not too violent, but definitely some sort of collapse as a society, as a civilization. And I wonder, what steps do you think Watership Down teaches, let's say, its readers about surviving and rebuilding?
That's a great question. I think number one is to have people that you can put faith in, and that might mean taking a risk. Be like, oh, hey, my friends are gonna go start building houses in Texas. I'm gonna just go and see how that goes, and roll the dice. So having people that you trust, that you're willing to suspend your disbelief on, that's number one. Number two, have people that you look up to and admire, but also be okay accepting someone into your sphere of influence in your circle that is, not as far along as you. And Hazel makes that point because he expected that most of the rabbits that would follow Fiverr, which was the case, were these kind of outskirters, who were getting a bad time, who didn't have much going for them in the Sandalford Warren. And so it's almost like, when you're training a combat sport, you should train with people who are on your same level. You should train with people who are better than you, but you should also train with people who are not as skilled as you. And it's having those kind of three categories in your friend circle is one that's really important. And then just keep moving forward. That was the biggest thing. If there's anything in this life that comes easy, it's probably not worth it.
I think those are excellent steps, and I hope that people who are listening out there heed that sort of advice. I know personally, I've kind of been preparing, whether it's squirreling away provisions or having a sort of family back out plan, let's say, and figuring out where the move might be if it ever comes to that. But I wanted to ask you, Brett, and to we're sort of circling around the novel, talking about it without getting into the details, and I want to save the details maybe for the end, because I'm also fascinated about, you said that you read it every year, and I want to know what effect that it's had on you throughout the years. You seem to be, I'd say, a pretty accomplished guy, and successful. You're a family man, you're a fighter, you've written a few books, and you seem to have something figured out, I'd say, because every time I interact with you, you also have a smile on your face. You're a pretty happy guy. I think you got something figured out, and I guess I want to know what it is that you've got figured out, and if you've read into that from this book at all.
Thank you so much for the compliments. You're really kind. I it's kind of fake it until you make it, I guess. But it's all God, man. It's all God. And so this book, it's meant so many different things to me at different stages of my life. When I was in college, my roommate in college, he also loved this book, and but we couldn't decide like which rabbit we would be, because I was more of the fighter and he was more of the cerebral leader to whom I deferred. And so he always kind of assumed the role of Hazel, and he said, okay, you can be Bigwig. And I love Bigwig. But now, I kind of think it's like, oh, am I trying to be more like Hazel and or am I more like Blackberry or Captain Holly, and just all these different characters. So trying to see myself and emulate some of the characteristics of each rabbit has been something that I've tried to do. But one of the most profound things, and so I was asked to speak in church a while ago, and I used this story. So you're right there. They have this rich religion and history, and they have these tales that these rabbits have continued, and their hero, their Odysseus, their Robin Hood, their Achilles is this rabbit named El Herrera. And they tell the story of the blessing of El Herrera, and it starts out with the creation of the world, and God, they call Frith, the sun, creates the world, and all the animals are the same. And they all eat grass. They all eat flies. There's no predatory animals. But the rabbits, they multiply and eat more grass than any other animal. And God, Frith, tells El Herrera, as the leader of these rabbits, hey, you got to get your people under control. And he says, hey, we eat more and we multiply faster than any other animal, and that just shows you how much we love you, and because we're taking advantage of your creation. And the book says that El Herrera could have been killed for that insolence, but God, wanted to keep him in the world, and so decided to get the better of him. So he gives all the animals their unique qualities. Cats get, eyes that see in the dark and silent paws. Owls get good eyesight and wings and all these other things. Foxes get good senses of smell, and he makes all these predators and fills them with the desire to hunt and kill the children of El Herrera. And then El Herrera hears about this, and he starts digging into the side of the hill to hide. And El Herrera comes over the hill and sees El Herrera's, hind quarters sticking out of the ground. And he says, hey, I'm looking for El Herrera to give him a blessing. He's like, well, I haven't seen him. And he's like, well, I'll give you the blessing. Come out of that hole. He's like, can't do it. You can bless my bottom. I got to dig because there's predators coming. And God says, very well, bless your bottom. So he gives him powerful hind legs and a tail that flashes. And El Herrera takes off, runs faster than any animal. And this was the line that has stuck with me. And I always choke up when I repeat it. But it says, in that moment, El Herrera knew that even though he would not be mocked, yet Frith was his friend. And that has humbled me so much, and remembering like that God will not be mocked. And anytime that I've tried to, go it alone or, do my own thing, it has not worked out for me. But I know that God is my friend. And so like that was a cool thing. And so there's a lot of parallels there, to Adam and Eve being kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and now instead of spontaneously bringing forth fruit, there are thorns and briars and weeds, and you have to work to it. And Lord Frith tells El Herrera that all the world will be your enemy, and that all these creatures will hunt you, and if they catch you, they will kill you. But first they have to catch you. So just, being uncatchable is the way to go.
Yeah, you could definitely say that there is a Christian allegory in this book, that we are not friends to the world, though we live in the world. And I think it's Abraham, right, who says that he is a friend of God. So that's it's funny, if there was a Canon Fodder sort of bingo card, me talking about faith eventually comes back into the fold. And I think, I think that's a good sign. Like, I think if you've written a good book, it probably points back to scripture in some ways. And, we only discuss good books on this podcast.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's true. And I'm sure there are non-Christians who love Lord of the Rings or Watership Down even, and can still get a lot out of it. But it's like we were talking about, there are these timeless truths. I mean, even, the Iliad, clearly not Christian, but it does teach, these eternal truths and values, and there are some good lessons. Yeah, this book's incredible. What was maybe one of your favorite parts of the book? I gotta ask.
I would say, actually, and I was going to bring this up, but the descriptions of Ephrathah, right, the police state under the General Wormwood or
Woundwort, yeah.
yeah. It just, I think, and when I say he, I mean Adams, he did a really good job of describing sort of the human, the very human aspects of totalitarianism, of we'll call it a police state, but just of top-down control, and trying to even fight against nature, because you have these rabbits who, like the term mating like rabbits is a trope for a reason, right? But you have this guy who's trying to one, he's not letting anybody leave, even though it's clear that there's a crowding problem in the warren. He's also stopping several people or several rabbits rather, from mating, which is completely anathema to their being. And then also just trying to keep them under an iron fist. I thought it was apt for sort of the times we're living in, while also, just you've read my first book, so you know that I'm all about dystopia.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was so cool to read that and see, because I mean, talk about it like a villain who's very well executed. And General Woundward is this commanding presence. Not only is he physically capable, but he's also just so cunning. And he's got all these lieutenants that have, that are trying to emulate him and are so hated. And yeah, that whole part with Bigwig going undercover, spoiler alert. I don't think we need to worry about spoiler. If you haven't read the book, I mean,
Yeah,
you need to read it.
that's one thing. We don't permit spoiler culture here.
Good.
If you're listening to this, we're going to talk about the book, and that's another check on the bingo scorecard. Is talking about how much I hate when people talk about spoilers. So go ahead, Brett. Just unload both barrels.
Excellent. Yeah, it's just so cool. And that actually reminds me, one other quality that I think we have to have in order to be able to escape the whirlpool that we might get caught in the future is, we're not going to be able to do business as usual. Business as usual is what got us into this mess in the first place. So kind of being willing to go outside our comfort zone, like when Hazel saves that mouse, the mouse that has evidently nothing to offer him, but then later it's one of the mice that warns them of Woundworth's approach, when he's looking for vengeance. And then when they help Kihar, the gull, and bring him back to health, it's just these kind of just these unorthodox methods, and again, not knowing and not looking for any self-aggrandizement or what can I get out of this, but just helping people, and then you'll be surprised when you turn around.
Yeah, no, I think definitely the inclusion of Kihar and the mouse shows that Hazel's Warren, but at Watership Down, has the has Providence on their side, right? They are faithful, and they are kind and generous, and that is why they are able to be fruitful in their new land. One could even, I'm going to bring this to Exodus real quick. You see that, out of Exodus, and really in the book of Joshua, actually, the Israelites, are not kind to their neighbors, to the residents of the promised land. And, we'd probably go off into another 2-hour tangent about that, which I'm totally open to, but I don't know if the listeners are. I'm gonna get the analytics for this, and there's just gonna be a huge drop. But yeah, and there's still even room for kindness, like I think it's at the siege of Ai, right? Or it's either Ai or Jericho, but Rahab, the prostitute, and her family, she is
Jericho.
Jericho. Thank you. She is spared from the from the slaughter because she is kind to the people coming in. So you kind of have this reversal where the rabbits go to Watership Down and are show kindness to the mouse, and the mouse later repays that. I don't know. There's some interesting parallels there to the Old Testament, and like we said, the Aeneid earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's fascinating too is that Adams, he all these great British authors, especially, and certainly they're Americans as well. But if you look at C.S. Lewis, you look at J.R.R. Tolkien, you look at Richard Adams, they all fought, and in World War II, or
Uh,
in J.R. Tolkien's and C.S. Lewis's case, World War I,
right, right.
but Adams in World War II, and I think that having been a soldier uh, is such not necessarily a prerequisite, but if you are able to take that and then keep going, so I that's why I think writing is so good for people, and I think that if we can get our veterans to write more, that we're going to see a new crop of these incredible authors, and it's just good for you. It's good for the soul.
Have you read Breakfast with the Dirt Cult?
No, I have not, and I've
Yeah,
been
you
meaning to
definitely
read
should.
it.
It's a great book. There's a reason why Finley is everywhere, it seems. I picked it up maybe a year ago, and I should actually have somebody on to talk about it because I really enjoyed that book. And
You, you should
it's
have Bennett from Exit. He's a big fan of that book.
I will reach out to him about that. That's a great idea. But I really enjoyed that book, and that's probably the Iraq Afghanistan sort of global war on terror novel. There's Redeployment by Phil Cly. I don't know if you've read that. That's a pretty good one too. That's a collection of short stories. I really enjoyed that one. But something more honest, and maybe it's just because of my own proclivities to be uh, yeah, maybe I just see myself more in Finley's character than what Cly writes about. Um, but yeah, I love that book, and I agree that there needs to be some more GWAT guys writing out there.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, look at Clay Martin; he's phenomenal as well at writing, and it's been really good for him and for his readers. So I think that that's good. But what I was going to say is, so a lot of these characters, it's funny. Adams actually talks about, so Kihar is based on this Polish fighter that he knew during the war, and Hazel is based on an officer that he knew, and Bigwig was another guy that he knew who was a tremendous fighter. He described him and was always at his best when he was told exactly what he had to do.
Mm.
Um, and I think you can kind of see that because I always think that for me it would be really hard to be undercover because I'm not a good liar. And that was hard for Bigwig to do that and to like be mean, like he kind of had to
Yeah,
like
no, he's a jerk at the beginning.
right, yeah,
One of the early things about him that I liked in his arc is he initially thinks that he's in charge, right? Because he is the biggest, because he was in the Ausla of of the other Sandalford Warren, right? He just automatically assumes that this is his mission to lead. And Hazel, Hazel doesn't sort of beat him with brute strength, but he does gain respect. I think it's actually it's probably after he gets caught in the snare, right? That Bigwig really sees Hazel in a more deferential mood, let's say, right? He's more deferential to Hazel. So really interesting and well done character arc for Bigwig, but also for Hazel, who just he does come into his own as somebody, as a man, or I keep saying man because I mean they're basically people.
exactly.
You could replace all the out. You could just set this on a different planet, and just these would be people, and there would just be weird language. You know, we have a few friends, you and I, who write uh, anthropomorphic fiction. Let's say, right? Parse. He writes. He writes about sheep. the outgoing misanthrope. He has a book coming out that is anthropomorphized. What is it about? I mean, everybody knows this book, and then also Animal Farm by George Orwell. What is it about putting? Why do people put their problems onto animals? What's that all about, Brett?
Yeah, that's a good question. Rudyard Kipling certainly did that with his two
Right.
Jungle
Yeah.
Books.
The Jungle Books. Yeah. And then
Yeah,
there's George Saunders also has a short book about foxes. I didn't read it. My wife read it, but she liked it. But yeah, there's a lot out there by some really big names.
yeah, absolutely. And I think just because, I mean, you look at Aesop's fables too, and
Good point.
and I think just keeping it simple really speaks to people, because it's enough detached that it doesn't cause that hard sort of introspection. I was thinking about this, and I feel like I bet what's his name, Pierce Brown, who wrote the Red Rising series. Is it Pierce Brown?
I
No.
don't know, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Aristophanes, he's a big fan of those books too. They're worth reading, but I could see him taking some things from this. But I think this story would have been harder to tell it with people, like actual humans, because there's enough degrees of separation that the violence isn't because it is nature, that it's pretty normal for a dog to kill a rabbit or a cat to kill, and for animals to die for one reason or another. But I think that people are able to identify with animals almost easier than they are able to identify with other people. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I
no,
don't know. I'm just
that makes a lot
spitballing.
of sense. And one could dismiss a work like this if it had people in it and just be like, oh, just go read the Aeneid, bro. Like it's adding that layer. And I don't think Adams was doing it as a gimmick or as a hook or something, but it definitely gets one. It piques one's interest when that layer of complexity is added.
Yeah.
Speaking of complexity, the film, the animated film, I think it was from the 70s, even, right, or the 80s. It's
Yeah, I think 70s.
it's a
Yeah.
I think it might be a masterpiece of animation. Just what it was able to do, especially at the time period, and what it was able to really get away with for. It definitely was one of the first adult coded animated films, because really before that it was Disney. Like, I mean, I don't know if you ever watched Fritz the Cat, but
Yeah.
I yeah, so like that existed, like, and there was certainly more risque stuff out there, but this was a serious attempt at treating children like small adults, and not coddling to them. Uh, a lot of people will say that the movie is scarring. I definitely, I joked with you about that at the beginning. But I wanted to get your thoughts on the film while I have you here, and what you liked, what you didn't like, if there were any changes. Especially, this is one of your favorite books. It's always interesting to see what people think about film adaptations of their favorite books.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I like it. That's the short answer. I've always enjoyed it. I think, who did the song in it? Was that Simon and Garfunkel?
It might have been, yeah,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
so. Yeah, and I'm a big Simon and Garfunkel fan, thanks to my dad, who also loves this book. But the only thing that I almost felt like the film could have been longer for what they showed. I think they got everything right that they showed. There's so much more that they weren't able to include. I like how they did the fight with between Bigwig and Woundwort, but that fight, when you read it, it's a little bit more rich, and it's not as fast paced, just because there's more going on during that fight, and
Right.
they're kind of talking. Holly comes up behind Bigwig and says like, "Hey man, like, can I can I tag in?" And he's like, "No." And then Woundward actually does have Verbatim go back, and then Verbatim chickens out as well. So there were just some of those nuances that I missed. I will say that I could not even bring myself to watch the latest Netflix adaptation, the Netflix and BBC.
I didn't
I had
even know they made one.
I mean, it looks, again, I haven't seen it. So any listener out there, please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm happy to be wrong. But so they got John Boyega to be the voice of Hazel, and he also narrates the beginning, the story I told you, but just did not get the tonality of El Herrera and Frith right. It was almost kind of more impudent, and they didn't have that friendship, which is the most important part of El Herrera
So
and Frith.
you started it, and
Yeah.
just that just left the bad taste in your mouth.
Could not do it. And for some reason they made Strawberry's character a female, and
Oh, well, of course, and this is Netflix.
and and just the animation was bad. And now they delayed that by like 6 years. They were supposed to release it. So I thought, I'm like, man, this thing better be good. And it wasn't. So I'm sure someone will do another adaptation eventually. But yeah, I like the 70s film. I think it's good. And people, like, we were joking about it being scarring. Yeah, I mean, it's unusual. It's not the same flavor. But I think like it's pretty real. And I do love the ending. I thought they really got the dog and General Woundward right. That fight where Woundward's like, dogs aren't dangerous, and they're like charging slow-mo. So that was one of my favorite scenes. And then the Black Rabbit of Inlay, who's basically death, the embodiment of death to rabbits. I thought that was kind of cool when Hazel's kind of knocking at death's door.
Yeah, one kind of thinks that the dog, or the general facing off against the dog, you could see parallels to like maybe even the First World War there, where there's just this naivete about what kind of fight they're going to be in. I co-sign everything that you just said. I didn't know that they were making a Netflix adaptation, or if they've already made it. Maybe it's one of those
like
things.
Episodic. I think they had they broke down to like 6 episodes.
Oh, see, because like I prefer that, because you really can cover everything there. But if you're gonna do a bad job about it, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, I might try. I might just go watch it. I mean, it can't be much worse than other stuff they've been putting out lately.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, maybe, and it might be something. You said your daughter's 8, so it might be something that you guys can watch together. And I'm sure that she's well versed in it at this point. You can point out to her and start her on that whole noticing trend early. You gotta get them early on the noticing.
Absolutely. One thing I gotta say too that I didn't get to mention earlier is I think that, and General Warner isn't just he's not just bad for bad sake, and I think it might be overdone nowadays. Like, make the bad guy sympathetic, or he has a tragic backstory. But I mean, you can really see what he was about and why he did the things that he was doing, and they kind of juxtapose all these different leadership styles. I mean, you have the 3-Raw right at the beginning, who's, a fairly steady leader. He's not a bad guy by any means, but he's so slow and ponderous, and he won't do anything if it's not his idea. And that ends up to the Homeworn being destroyed.
One imagines him as a turtle instead of a rabbit.
Yep, exactly. Then you have Cowslip, who's a deceiver and in denial, and is okay with sacrificing his people periodically just for some semblance of of ease and luxury. And then you have Woundwort, who's a totalitarian, police state, and you know, it just kind of going about it the wrong way. But probably the coolest scene is when Hazel and Woundwort face off, and Hazel is like trying to convince him, like, hey, we don't have to fight. We can establish, some rapport, and we can, if we can help each other. You send some of your people because your place is overcrowded. We'll go back and forth. We can make an alliance. And the way that Adams described how Woundwort, like for a second, like sees that, yes,
Right,
this
yeah.
would be the right thing, and then just breezes over it.
Like he's yeah, definitely. He has that moment, that aha moment, but whether it's his pride, whether it's, ego, whether it's some character flaw within him, and it could even be probably the same flaw that the Thera has, Thera. I could
Yeah,
never pronounce
3Ra.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I could
3Ra.
never pronounce
I
that.
know, yeah, it's hard pronunciation on a lot of those
But
names.
like to and the same with Cowslip, it's, well, this has been working, so we'll just keep doing this, right? It If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But at the same time, not realizing that, yes, everything around you is quite broken. And I like at the very end how once the general is out of there is a lasting peace between Ephrafa and Watership Down, and actually new warrens are created from the excess population of both to to really fulfill God's promise to the rabbits in some respect, that they were going to keep doing this, and yeah, they're going to keep getting hunted, but they're also going to keep eating the grass and going to be swift-footed and clever, and they're going to mate rapidly. And we even see that in the epilogue, which I wanted to talk about, where Hazel, after a long life, is rewarded by being allowed to join the Owsla of, the Abraham figure in this rabbit world, let's say.
Yeah, it's such a good ending, and it's really, really, it's just so cathartic. You love to see a happy ending, and yeah, there's some real tragedy. I think for me, one of the coolest parts is the fight scene between Bigwig and Woundwort, and we kind of talked about that, but just like how Bigwig fights him, and like as soon as Woundwort actually kind of realizes that he's afraid, and so he ends up going back out, and Bigwig advances and just kind of lays down in the entrance to the tunnel and figures, hey, even if I die, they're going to have a hard time getting to my friends.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
he's so big.
Yep.
And he also he injures Woundwort at the same time. So they would have to move both of them. Yeah, that's a really, talk about a 180 for a character, because you have, at the beginning, you have Bigwig. Sorry, there's so many freaking names, and they're all very odd. But you have Bigwig, who leaves for selfish reasons. You're led to believe that he wants to be his own sort of petty tyrant, and maybe even have like a bunch of does to himself, right? And have all these lesser rabbits sort of defer to him, to now him kind of having his own like little heroic last stand. And luckily he makes it out at the end. But he doesn't know that he's going to survive this, but he's willing to sacrifice himself for the greater good of the Warren. So yeah, I think Bigwig might be my favorite character from the whole book.
Yeah, mine too. And like it gives me like a burst of adrenaline. It's funny because like I feel like saying like it gives me chills, like it's kind of a gay thing to say, but like, but I think it gives me like a boost of adrenaline. Like when I think of these things that it's just like, ooh, that's a really like cool line. And you see that like in films or music or anything that kind of inspires you. And it's the part where Bigwig, because Woundward is trying to talk him out. It's like, hey, like, let's just end this nonsense. I'll give you, a leadership role back in Ephrathah. Just, give up, like surrender. And Bigwig says, my chief rabbit ordered me to defend this tunnel. And until he says otherwise, I'm not moving. And then Woundward and all his guys and some of his guys just like leave right at that moment because they never considered that Bigwig wasn't the chief rabbit. And so to them, they think, man, there must be an even bigger,
a bigger, stronger rabbit. Like, oh man, this guy defers. This guy's not scared, but like he bows down to somebody else. This must be one heck of a rabbit, No, that's really well put, Brett. So we're coming up close to an hour now, and I wanted to know if there was anything about Watership Down that we might not have covered before we start wrapping up.
Yeah, I think we've touched on so many good points. It's just a really rich story, and I would encourage listeners to read it. If there are some listeners who just have too many books that they're reading right now, if you are going to listen to the audio version, you have to get the one that's read by Peter Capaldi. Peter Capaldi does a phenomenal job.
What is that name? He's an actor, right? That it sounds familiar. Well, yeah. What's he been in?
So he's been in a few things. He's in Paddington Bear, if you've seen that.
I've heard it's good. I haven't seen it.
Paddington Bear, the first and the second, are probably two of the best movies ever made, and they have like just like no joke.
It's funny because there's that Nicolas Cage movie that came out like a year or two ago with the guy who plays the Mandalorian, and he says that his favorite film is Paddington 2, and then they watch it and like you just see Nicolas Cage bawling his eyes out. So I've always taken that as a joke. So now I got to watch Paddington.
Yeah, I guess. Absolutely, so good. Yeah, what is that movie called? It's like the incredible or unbearable weight of incredible talent or something like that.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So that's right. He's in that. He's also. Have you seen World War Z with Brad Pitt?
Yeah.
So he's the sort
terrible
of old. Yeah, terrible. He's one of the World Health Organization doctors.
I'm sure I'm going to look him up after, and I'm sure because I'm just trying to get a feel for his voice. But
yeah, he's in he's one of the Doctor Who's. Like I don't know if you ever heard that show.
Okay, that's why I've heard the name before. Yeah.
Super talented and does incredible. And every rabbit he does a different voice for, and he just nails it. So definitely recommend that. And just this is one of the books you have to read in your lifetime. It's a must read. My dad didn't read it until just the last few years. We were on a road trip for my cousin's wedding. We drove from Washington State to North Dakota and back in the course of from Thursday to Sunday. So we were driving more than we were at the wedding, and just to stay awake, I just told him the whole story. But it's a great book. You're gonna find something that you resonate with.
And I will say that I think that the book for those who have a large to read stack like I do, went pretty quick actually. It's not I have a small one of those like 3x5 paperback books. It's like so it's almost 500 pages. But it, pretty quick book. Reads quickly, and definitely a lot of action. We didn't get into how good of a writer Adams is. You touched on it a little bit, but yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I think I might have lost you here. Hold on. Yeah.
Oh no, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, your
Okay.
camera's cutting out a little bit. I'll
Oh.
probably cut some of this in editing. But Brett, where can people find you? Where can they read the Frank Sawyer series, and how can they support your podcast and your other works?
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, follow me on Twitter, Brett W. Cain. I'm pretty active on there. Yeah, you can buy my books. They're available on Amazon, and even better if you go to Nauvoo Supply Company. They're also on Twitter, Nauvoo Supply Co. And yeah, listen to the Ironside podcast. I want to make you a frequent flyer there, because you are so good at this, and you're such a great guest as well, and an even better host. So thank you for
I
having me
appreciate
on.
that. Yeah, no, this was a blast. We definitely gotta do this again. And I'll DM you, and we'll figure out another book to maybe we'll do Paddington. No, I'm kidding. But if you're listening out there, if you've made it through all my rambling, I just want to say thank you. If you want to support this podcast, you can become a subscriber on the Double Dealers Substack. You can become a paid subscriber there as well. You can buy my books. You can buy the Double Dealer magazine. Issue 12 is coming out. It should be out by the time that this podcast is out. So look for that on Amazon, and we'll be making sure to fill the timeline with all the various ways that you can pick up the magazine, as well as Brett's books. There'll be plenty of links. You won't be able to say, oh, I wasn't able to find Brett because of me. I never know how to end these podcasts, so I'm just going to say insert ending right here.